Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the AppSec Insiders Podcast. My name is Jared, and I'm a senior application security consultant here at Forward Security. And this week I'm joined with my co-host, Farshad Abbasi, the founder and chief security officer at Forward Security.
Hi, everybody. Hello.
And so for those who are new to the AppSec Insiders, this is a show where we discuss the latest trends, the best practices, and current events in the world of application and cloud security. If you're an AppSec professional and you're looking for an opportunity to work with some of the best in the industry or a developer with an interest in cybersecurity, be sure to check out our careers page at forwardsecurity.com/careers. We would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to the show, and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at Forward Security. Links are in the show notes. So just before we get into today's topic, I just usually here we would mention all the events that we're going to be taking part in, but we just finished up a whole bunch of them. We had a very successful attendance at the Collision Conference, and Farshad perhaps can talk a little bit about that for a minute. And we are, of course, always looking at new things to attend. At some point in August, there's going to be DEF CON. We're looking into that. And of course, there's always your monthly and weekly OWASP local chapters to look into. When I looked up the upcoming events in Toronto, where I am, I didn't see any, but it could just be they're not updating the page. They usually do have them. Same with Ottawa. However, in Vancouver, over on Farshad's side, they have one coming up July 20th. So that's in 16 days from now. All right, let's get into it. Today, we're going to be talking about Azure Cloud specifically, and how monitoring and logging keeps you in the know and keeps your system safe. Specifically, we want to call this raising alarms and reducing the blast radius. So we got a range of topics to cover. I think, let me just take a look at my list here. I think first, why don't we briefly explain what Azure and its security services are, just as an intro for people who are listening. Do you want to take a crack at that?
You mean Azure has security services?
It does. It has at least one, maybe up to 3,000 of them. There's so many to cover. It's a bit of a confusing ecosystem. It's very, very robust, very powerful, very enterprisey, if you want to call it that, which is great for enterprise. But it also means that it has a steep learning curve for sure.
Definitely. I know that, you and I have been in that world for a while, and, things are still cloudy, for the lack of a better word. But as you said, there are a number of really good services, and once you get to know them, you can use them quite effectively. And, some of those, I guess today, as you said, Jared, our focus is on logging and monitoring services, things that are in that detection umbrella. And to name a few, Azure Security Center is probably the one that most people are familiar with. If not, you should be familiar with it right away. Azure Monitor is another one that comes to mind. Log Analytics, there's Sentinel. So those are some of the key ones that I think the audience should be familiar with. But, of course, there's a number of other services as well. Then maybe there's the Azure Policy, and there's the Advanced Threat Protection and Azure Network Security. All of these can provide you with information and services that can be helpful in your logging and monitoring journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important also to point out that a lot of resources already produce logs. They already emit logs. And so what we'll be talking today about is the types of logs that don't automatically get emitted, which services, so which services don't have that enabled. For the services that do have it enabled, which logs are they producing, and what extra stuff to turn on. So I'm just, as a high level, I'm going to say one of those things would be like, when you'll get metrics about your virtual machine, but you won't get insights into what's going on inside the virtual machine. You have to install an agent for that type of thing.
That's a good tip.
Yeah.
That confused me for a while in the beginning. I wasn't thinking in that way, but as you said, there's stuff that they're getting themselves, but if you want visibility inside, you'd have to install additional tools and agents. The other thing that confused me in the beginning, as I was learning this, is that some of the services are collecting logs, but if you don't take them away, they're just gone. So that was another thing, is like, this service by default, as you're saying, is generating the logs, but you actually got to set it up so that it sends it somewhere to like a log analytics space and things like that. So
Yeah.
that was something I was like, oh, do I have to turn on the logging? But it's not like that. It's like, it's there. And I think if I'm not mistaken, some of them keep it for up to 90 days and then it's gone. And it's just really up to you to centralize that admission and putting it somewhere.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. So why don't we start with, I want to, okay. Let's, before we get into specifics, let's talk about why do we log? Why log? It costs money. You got to store them somewhere. It's a lot of data to parse through. Is this something that a startup should be using or only a really big company should be using? Why do we log and what level of application should be logging?
To log or not to log, that's the question, right?
It is. Yeah.
Basically, as statistics have shown, the longer you let someone go undetected, the more likely that they're able to find things that they could use to compromise your system, right? I mean, if we look at, I always like using physical world examples. If you look at in the physical world, places, let's talk about casinos, right? DEF CON, Vegas, they put cameras and they're basically capturing all the stuff that's happening somewhere centrally. And then if something later on, if they detect that malicious activity was happening, they can go back and review all the video footage, right? Mm-hmm. That's essentially logging in the physical world. They're capturing video footage of all the places that are key. Or in cases of a business, right? They put security cameras in the entry points of their business in retail or other stores. They're monitoring who's coming and who's going. And then if an incident happens, they can go and view those video footage and figure out what happened. And that's pretty much the same thing what we're trying to do in the virtual world, right? Like capturing those the evidence so that later on we can go and figure out if who did it and what. But beyond just the evidence, also using it to trigger an alert that lets us know something bad is happening, right? So it's sort of like, hey, we won't be able to stop it, but at least we can maybe contain it, right? And so if you don't have that visibility, that provides the attackers the opportunity to go on for a long time and doing reconnaissance and discovery on your system, and then eventually they'll find a way. But if you can nip it in the butt by like, hey, someone is actually, doing reconnaissance, someone is doing an enumeration on my endpoints and things like that, that could mean that, someone is actually trying to learn about our system and further compromise it. So yeah, logging and monitoring, really important.
Yeah, I have to definitely agree that nowadays, because data storage is so cheap, people just log everything, just log it all. Any little thing you want, you throw it into a big pool. And then if you notice something in the future, you have that log to go back to. Like I said, especially in Azure, storage is super cheap. And then on the monitoring side, the monitors will look at your stream of logs, and it'll look for, usually the way they work is they look for either some anomaly. So it'll train for a couple of weeks on your data, your apps. Your app runs for 2 weeks, your system runs for 2 weeks. The monitor is looking at all these logs, and then you start putting it into protection mode instead of what do they call it, learning mode or whatever they call it. And now if it sees something that doesn't match the patterns that it's seen, it'll flag it as an anomaly, and then it'll alert either your security IT people, or you can even have it run some sort of action if you think that it definitely should never see it, this anomaly definitely should never happen. If you're confident about that, you can have it automatically run some Azure function or something like that to take action on whatever that is. So you can block the IP address that's trying to attack, or you can prevent a resource from being spun up, things like that.
It's funny that how the name, the continually keeps being like abbreviations and categories and names, right? And SOAR is the category where you orchestrate the response of security incidents, and you automate, hey, like you said, Jared, like blocking IP addresses based on incidents. There's a whole cottage industry of SOAR provided. It used to be SIM. SIM was all the detection capabilities, and then there came the SOAR category, which is all the orchestration of the remediation and automating that. Yeah. The one thing you touched on that it's really important for our audience to note is that, these alerts, if you don't fine tune them appropriately, you're going to get false positive fatigue. You're just going to get, your system is going to throw a lot of alerts for everything. And then this is what I usually see happening is companies adopt these systems and they don't spend the time to actually fine tune the alerting. And then, it's all the generic alerts that are out of the box. and then they may not be very meaningful, right? You and I spend a lot of time in application security testing, and we always tell our clients, hey, don't look at the vulnerabilities, combine the vulnerabilities into threat scenarios and act based on threat scenarios that are applicable to you. And the same lesson, the same principle should be applied here for logging and monitoring. What companies should do is, rather than just look at all the alerts, which are the equivalent of the vulnerabilities, they should look at what are the threat scenarios that I'm in, that if they happen would be bad to my company. And then based on those threat scenarios, come up with controls, including the detective capabilities, right? For example, if a threat scenario is that someone is going to brute force the application and bypass the authentication, gain access to sensitive data, then there should be logging and monitoring on failure and successive authentication. So depending on the threat scenarios and which ones are higher risk for the company, those are the alerts. The alerts should be fine-tuned to match those threat scenarios. Then you're not getting false positive fatigue. Then you're only getting alerts based on things that are relevant and contextual, in the same way that we apply that when we do the application security risk assessments.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely agree. Having context into what you see and deciding whether or not to act on those is hard enough, let alone when you have hundreds of thousands of results coming in every day. So yeah, having some automated system to help you with that and to help with visualization also. I mean, that's when you have a human looking at it. That's interesting as well, but also, just to be able to act and remediate on automatically is just so super helpful.
Yeah, and then building use cases. So I guess the formal terminology would be use case development. So before you start installing any of these things, you basically build those use cases, and how you build them is through threat modeling. So the first thing that I would recommend to the audience before they go down this path is spend the time, threat model your system, and then build those use cases, which would then raise alerts on the highest risk threat scenarios. Then go ahead and put together your logging and monitoring, services and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Because you want to see which. I mean, it doesn't hurt to just log everything, but especially for monitoring and alerting. Yeah. I mean.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, you look at the connections between your resources and where it's valuable, which applications are touching important data, which applications are externally facing or along some path accessible to some externally facing thing, and have start with your monitoring at those places. The internal network, of course, you want to eventually have the same kind of monitoring turned on, but I would say that the attack surface is only the people who are on your network. So there's a lower chance, at least in the beginning, just by numbers, that there will be some kind of attack there. Of course, insiders are a massive portion of attacks that go on out there. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that those types of companies have already done a lot to secure their externally facing things. And so the next best place to try to attack them is from the inside. So as far as prioritizations go, because you can't do everything all at once, start by adding all this type of monitoring to your externally facing and services that are also along a path of externally facing things in your network, and then start from the inside out as well.
It's funny. I often get asked, Jared, by individual clients and colleagues and all that, like, hey, if we were to start logging things, what are the 4 areas of our application which we log, right? The number one answer is authentication is always really important, right? Like the first thing, even with Azure, if people are going to bypass and come and use your Azure services, they have to bypass authentication. So success and failure of authentication is probably the number one thing that people should be logging and alerting on. But then they ask us, like, well, failure, I get it, because it looks like someone is trying to brute force the password. Why success? It's like success is also important because maybe you look at patterns. Hey, Farshad never logs in at 2 a.m, but he logged in at 2 a.m. on Tuesday. That should be alert. So success is important because you could see anomalous patterns in people logging in, and failure is important because it could be bypassing brute force potentially. The other 3 that are important is failure of authorization. Because if someone is using the endpoint or APIs normally, then they wouldn't fail on authorization. It's only you fail on authorization when you're trying to access something you're not supposed to. So that's the reason that you should be alerting on that. And then the other 2 is if you're right, if you have an application API endpoint, you should make sure that failure of input validation as well as deserialization failures should also be logged. Again, those are, why would you fail on input? Oh, that's because someone put malicious input. Or why would you fail on deserialization? Someone wasn't following the normally serialized format. Those all could be because people are doing reconnaissance on the application. Now, on the infrastructure layer, again, it should be based on threat model. So, like as Jared was saying, if you have blob storage that's exposed to the outside, that's pretty important. You're exposing it externally. Make sure you turn on a bunch of things. Again, don't, sure, collect all the logs, but for the alerting, make sure you fine tune those with the threat scenarios. Now, let's talk about Security Center, because that's sort of the primary tool that sort of unifies security management within Azure, right? And it's probably the first thing people should start doing. And it allows, companies to continually monitor all their resources across Azure, but also the cool thing is also on premises as well, and other clouds, certain other clouds. So it's kind of not just limited to Azure. You can actually centralize everything. Now, sometimes people ask me, like, why would I use that? Like, what about a full SIM? Well, yeah, let's not confuse this with, like, this is not supposed to replace a SIM. This is supposed to be a good sort of starting point. And then, if you want to add a full-blown SIM, which you probably should, Azure has the Sentinel product, which is their cloud-native SIM. But, yeah, Jared, what else about Security Center that our audience should know about?
It's a good question. So I think you've covered a lot of it. I mean, it's essentially, they've named that one well. It's the center.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. It's where everything goes to. It's it doesn't work on its own. It needs to be configured to work with all the other services. But
one thing that
I don't know if this, what's
sorry.
that?
No, I was going to say one thing that a lot of our clients do as soon as they get an Azure, they just turn it on because it gives them a quick score. Yeah. It's like, hey, you haven't turned on MFA. It's all the basics, right? Like, so after listening to this podcast, if you have Azure, I recommend just going in there and looking at the dashboard and seeing what your score is. And then it just gives you some guidance, right? Like, go turn on the 2FA and a few other things that you should be doing.
And by the way, some of those recommendations won't necessarily apply to you. And then so that a lot of that has to do with tweaking the policies that you have turned on. Sometimes not, I mean, some of them are good recommendations, but not entirely necessary depending on the scale of your business. So one thing that I often see is it will make recommendations. It will say that you failed a check for whether or not you've used the sort of the bring your own key system. So it says right now you're using a Microsoft managed key, but you should be using your own customer managed key, which, by the way, great suggestion. I do think that I mean, it's not even my opinion. It's just that will help secure your system. But, if you're not a huge business yet, or you're not protecting medical data or financial data, those are the kinds of things that you can disable until you've reached a point where you're either storing that type of data or you're a big enough target. Because otherwise what happens is you get a humongous backlog of items to clean up based on wanting to get the big green circle in Microsoft Security Center.
Totally.
Yeah.
You want that green circle.
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch to talk about Azure Monitor. So, Azure Monitor is not supposed to be we're talking in the context of security, but it's primarily not a security service. What it's supposed to do is it's supposed to give you insight into the performance and health of your application, resource usage, network usage, infrastructure utilization. It's all the event management stuff that IT operations teams usually leverage to see how things are performing and troubleshoot things. But hey, guess what? It can have it can provide a lot of insight in terms of security. Why? For example, if all of a sudden one workload or one virtual machine is using a lot of memory, well, it could be that it's actually legitimately processing a lot of stuff. It could also be attacked. Yeah. So in security, it's always a really good idea to combine the stuff that you get from the IT side using Azure Monitor, and then aggregate it and try to see, like, hey, if these are, again, unusual trends, then based on those trends, maybe you should be doing something about it, right? Maybe you should be raising an alert. And I know that it integrates with log analytics so that you can take that stuff and combine it, and do more deeper analysis. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know if we've set this up before. It's not an area of deep expertise for me. But Jared, do you have anything you want to add on that one?
I mean, the Azure Monitor and log analytics, these are some of the basic things that you want to have turned on. And beyond that, this is about, all the various types of resources that you want to enable it on. just go ahead and enable it anywhere that you can think of. I feel like we probably won't have time in this podcast to get into some of the more fine-grained examples, which I wanted to do, because we still have a couple other things to cover. But I think as a best practice, what I would do is I would go and look at the best practice articles. Microsoft has a lot of them, especially for particular resources. You'll have a virtual machine best practices, for instance, for an app. What do they call it? The application services, app services. That's what it's called. Best practices, stuff like that. And they have best practices articles for a lot of those, and it'll tell you what types of logging that are not enabled by default that you should go ahead and enable. And there's so many different types of resources. I think even if we did have an hour in this podcast to cover it, we probably couldn't touch on it all, and especially mark for our audience which ones are the most important. But I think it's a good idea to just take stock of your inventory of resources and just do that 10 minutes of research for each one. They usually have a nice table that explains it really simply. So with our timing in mind, I think we should start talking about, let me just quickly give a high level of, there's Azure Sentinel, which is a cloud native SIEM, or SIEM, for those of you who are not familiar. That's the security, information, and event management solution. Basically gives you a way to, so it gives you a way to flag certain kinds of anomalies. It also gives you some kind of visualization, oftentimes. And I know that some of the other things we've talked about have those as well. There's a lot of, if you had a Venn diagram of these services, they do cross over a lot and share a lot of things in common. And that is to your benefit, so that if you only need a specific type of service, you don't need to turn on all 10 of them or whatever. So Azure Sentinel does some of the things that Azure Monitor does. It does some of the things that Security Center does, but its specific job is being a SIEM. Okay, so let's talk about reducing the blast radius, which I know was a heading for the title of this episode. So I think we should touch on that a little bit.
I just want to add one thing.
Please, yeah.
On Sentinel, that's really good. A really good point. Because sometimes I ask this question, like, well, there's all these different things, right? There's like Azure Security Center, there's Sentinel, there's Defender, even
Defender for Cloud, which we haven't talked about.
Yeah, like what, like, hey guys, like, what's the difference? What do I do? So here's the gist of it, right? Like, Security Center, as I mentioned, is like, that's a starting point, right? It's not meant to replace a full-blown SIEM. So if you're just starting out in this journey, get started with Security Center. Now, okay, great. So you graduate to a full-blown SIEM like Sentinel, and then Sentinel does AI-based analytics and lets you do more deeper threat hunting and a whole bunch of things that are way more advanced than Security Center. But what about Defender? So from what I understand, Defender used to be called Security Center Standard Tier. I think Jared just confused.
That's right. Yeah, super confusing.
Because Microsoft changed the name of one. And so it's now a standalone service. So it gives like advanced threat intelligence protection. It has this thing they call XDR, which I guess the category says extended detection and response. So it automatically collects, analyzes, integrates data from Azure resources, networks, partner solutions, like vulnerability scanners and endpoint protection solutions. So this helps you figure out threats quickly, but they're focusing on that whole endpoint. So you have like, on your Windows and Macs, you can have the Defender agent. Like, so Defender is now part of Windows, right? It does their malware detection and endpoint, all that stuff. So the whole Defender solution has become sort of this XDR, where it's gathering data from agents out there and then bringing it together and then figuring out if you're being attacked, for example. Whereas SIEM and Sentinel and Security Center, they're more along the traditional SIEM, where they're receiving logs from devices, whether on-prem or in the network, and doing that analytics on the information and providing you with alerts. So I hope that made sense. But that's sort of that's sort of how each of these things sit within that overall spectrum of detection services.
So let's talk about blast radius. What does it mean even to limit your blast radius? I have my definition, but I would love to hear your interpretation of that. What does it mean to limit your blast radius? Why do we do it?
The first time I heard that term was Bruce Schneier. This was years ago. Mm-hmm. He talked about like minimizing the blast radius. I think he was going through the LA airport, and someone had carried a gun, and they passed the security scanners,
Mhm.
and the scanner didn't detect it until half hour later. So what had happened is, because no matter which security gate you went through, everyone went into the same general boarding area. And then they had to empty everyone out of the entire airport, and then get it to all go through the scanners. And he was like, "Hey, if you had segregated these different security entry points, then you would have minimized the blast radius, so you wouldn't have to like get everyone off and put it
Mhm.
back on." Right? It's all about segregation, because if something blows up, if you've segmented it, then the blast radius is minimized just to that segment, right? Like, rather than the
Mhm.
entire place having to deal with the impact of it.
I think of it like a submarine.
Yeah,
Submarines have doors that seal shut, and that's not to have a big annoying door. It's so that if there's a leak somewhere, because of course you never want there to leak. You have a hull that's super strong and has multiple layers, but what if it does happen, and we have to prepare for those types of situations?
exactly.
And so you have these doors that seal up so that you have only one area that floods, and it doesn't reach all the other cabins or the control room or whatever.
Exactly. Minimizes the impact 100%.
Minimize the impact. And so as that relates here is, let's say somebody breaches your network. They have either found a vulnerability in your application, and so now they're inside the VNet of the application, or maybe they're even an insider and they have some access to some of your networks on the inside. So minimizing the blast radius, I mean, there are actions you can take. We're going to specifically talk about logging and monitoring, but of course, as a general rule, you want to make sure that your VNets, you have lots of VNets and lots of subnets, and they can only talk to the ones that they should be able to talk to. And, that everybody has, all your employees have multi-factor authentication, so that if credentials get leaked or whatever, it's not as much of a problem. There's also these Azure resource locks, and it helps prevent people from spinning up resources in the wrong region or of the wrong size, things like that. And okay, but as far as Azure, as far as monitoring goes, one of the biggest things you can do, and I'll just give you the headline here, is implementing Azure policies. Azure policies will essentially, there are some predefined ones that you can go for, but you can also create your own, and they're similar to resource locks in a way, but they're a little bit there's a bit of crossover there, I'll say. But the way that the Azure policy works is you set it up to say, for a particular resource group, for a particular group of users, for whatever conditions you want, only allow them to be able to spin up machines in this region, or only allow them to talk to this subnet, or only allow them to I'm trying to remember I'm trying to imagine what other things you can do with it. You can get pretty creative with it. But the nice thing is that if those policies are ever breached, that emits a log and goes to the Azure Monitor. And so you can have it either automatically restrict that action, or you can say, just log that, because now we can gain some information about whoever's trying to attack our system. You can also use it. I've seen articles that talk about setting them up like canaries to alert on things that are not necessarily detrimental to your system, but shouldn't happen. And so if they happen, you are sort of alerted that there's an attacker there. And so now you can start looking at the logs. And
Exactly.
anyhow, so that's a bit on reducing the blast radius.
And just to add to that, it's important to use these policies, because if you're not, using these to enforce the principle of least privilege, you're increasing the blast radius, right? Like, because, imagine if you allow people to do everything they wanted, if someone gets compromised, that attacker is going to be able to leverage the permissions and do everything they want.
Yeah.
But if you're using policies and really restricting access following that principle of least privilege, and only allowing access to things that should be accessed, and then using the role-based access control in conjunction with it, creating roles and saying, hey, this is a role for this type of a person that should be doing X, Y, Z to these resources, attach that policy. Now, you're only allowing what should be allowed for that particular role. And if someone gets compromised who has access to a role, then you minimize that blast radius as well. So,
absolutely. All right. So I think we should start wrapping up. So why don't we talk about, just quickly, let's go over maybe what types of threats are out there, what people should be looking for, and just sort of reiterate why are we doing this? Why are we logging, monitoring? Why are we? Just give us a nice, a nice little summary if you can.
Yeah, like I always use the example. I'll leave you with a summary story. I use the example of the Marriott Starwood breach that happened a number of years ago. When I was reading about it later on, they said that the attackers had 2 years to they were in the environment doing reconnaissance for 2 years, and they didn't have logging and monitoring.
Yeah.
They had logging and monitoring enabled, those attackers wouldn't be able to be in there for 2 years scanning the network, looking for open ports, looking for things. I think they ended up finding a way, and then they had got into one of the systems and all that. So lesson learned is, hey, logging and monitoring is important. Make sure you're logging. And maybe they had some logging and monitoring, but it wasn't looking at the right stuff, right? So going back to how we started this conversation, make sure you do that threat modeling, build the use cases, making sure you're logging and monitoring on where it matters most, and that's valuable, right? So that it's not like, oh yeah, we're doing something. Well, is it effective? Right. So I think that's the summary that I'll leave the audience with.
Very cool. Thank you. All right. Well, that's it. That's it for our show today. Farshad, thank you so much for joining us and for enlightening us with all this information. So to all of you out there, please subscribe wherever you listen to our show. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter @ForwardSecurity. The links, as always, are in the show notes. And if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, please, we could use it, because we can talk for hours about whatever we find interesting. But we're a small podcast, and if you email us, we're very likely to talk about whatever it is that you suggest. You can get in contact with us either by email or LinkedIn, or tagging us on Twitter. So as a reminder, if you're an AppSec professional and you're looking for an opportunity to work with us and some of the best in the industry, or if you're just a developer with an interest in cybersecurity, be sure to check out our careers page at forwardsecurity.com/careers. And lastly, if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing and sharing with anyone who you think may enjoy listening to this. That would mean a lot to us. This has been the AppSec Insiders. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.